My name is Sin Wang Chong. I am an associate professor in language education at the University of Edinburgh, and I'll be your host today. At the same time, as the convener of the ECR network at BIRA, I would like to welcome the attendees today. This webinar series is a continuation of our network's tradition of hosting academic writing related webinars for early career researchers and doctoral students. And this year in particular, we'd like to focus on journal peer review because we feel like it is a very important process, but at the same time, it's a process that is not very well understood and not always publicly discussed. So for this particular series, I've invited different journal editors to talk about their own stories and narratives of editing their own journals. I think it'll be quite a valuable and fruitful discussion because what we always see on journal websites, on publisher websites, that's an overview of the journal peer review process. We know the steps, but what are the specifics? What are some of the experiences or the tips from editors? I think that's something that I think we all can benefit from. So before I introduce today's guest, I would like to just talk a little bit about the three series. For today's topic, we focus on a journal that publishes academic work in relation to educational technology and applied linguistics. And in October, we'll have another session focusing on higher education journals. And we have two journal editors talking about higher education journals. And in our third episode, which is in November, we'll have a language education journal. So we hope that it covers, the series covers different disciplines, different fields. So for today's session, I'm very, very pleased to have Dr. Jim McKinney here with us. Jim is currently in Australia, and it's the evening Friday night. But Jim is here to talk to us about something that he is very passionate about, and a journal that he has edited for a while, the journal system. So I'd like to briefly introduce Jim, although I think most of you may know him already, but I would just do it because of formality. Dr. Jim McKinney is an associate professor of applied linguistics at UCL Institute of Education. Jim's research mainly explores implications of globalization for L2 writing, language education, and teaching in higher education. And Jim is a co-editor-in-chief of the journal System and series co-editor of Cambridge Elements language teaching. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Jim. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sinwang. It's funny. I think about I'm an editor of System that's included in my bio. It's sort of this integral part of my identity that I get. But yeah, hi everyone. Thank you for the introduction. I'm really happy to be here. I was saying earlier as we were preparing for this that I really appreciated the chance to kind of collect my ideas to share with you today. Like Sinwang says, this is going to be the stuff that you don't see on the journal website. I will share a couple of things from the website so we can talk about it a bit in detail, but I'm basically going to talk with you about kind of really what happens when a paper is submitted to the journal. And I'm also going to kind of talk you through a peer review process with two different examples. So I'm going to, let me make sure that I'm sharing successfully. Get this, is that working all right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, excellent. And then try to get the chat back up. I think I managed. Okay. So yeah, System Journal, just a really quick overview of the highlights. The purpose of the journal is to publish cutting edge research on the application of educational technology and applied linguistics to problems of foreign language teaching and learning. I'm going to go into a bit of the detail about the aims and scope of the journal because there's kind of a lot to consider there as far as the peer review process goes and how we as editors think about what the journal is doing and the direction the journal is going and as far as choosing what to publish in the journal. The types of papers that System publishes are full-length research articles for the most part. We also publish synthesis and meta-analytic reviews, as well as book reviews. I'm going to show you some of the statistics on those a little bit later on, so you can see what the ratio is of the types of articles. System is up to 8 issues per year, and we also have preprints and early online access. So basically, as a paper is accepted, it is generally online in less than 2 weeks for access. And it's can be accessed via Science Direct. It's also an Elsevier journal, so it can be accessed that way as well. At the bottom of the slide are all of our kind of main editorial team. We do have quite a large editorial board for System from a lot of different countries. We're trying to make sure we've got good geographic coverage as well as areas of expertise. And we try to do the same thing in our main editorial team as well. So the co-editors in chief are Idoia Ilola, who is Spanish and based in the United States. Maren Hennebury, who is Irish and based in Australia. There's me, who's American, based in the UK and currently in Australia. There's Lawrence Jun Zhang, who is from China and based in New Zealand. And there's Yongyan Zhang, who is Chinese and based in China. Our associate editor, Vincent Grenier, is in the UK as well. Our book reviews editor, Pascal Matzler, is in Chile. Our student editor is Nathan Thomas, who is currently my PhD student, but finishing at UCL Institute of Education. And I've also listed here our editorial assistant, Dr. Louise Maskill, because she plays an important role in the processing of papers submitted to System that I wanted to just try to clarify. So just focusing on this, just so you can see that System is a little bit unusual compared to other journals, although there are definitely some unusual editorial team structures at other journals. But we have 5 editors-in-chief, which is already really unusual. All of us equally manage submissions, manuscripts. Our associate editor, Vincent Grenier, does so as well, but on a smaller scale. Our book reviews editor only handles book reviews, doesn't handle any of the main manuscript submissions. Our student editor, this is a new role, but Nathan basically helps with finding reviews and makes suggestions for possible comments and feedback for submissions in case we do decide on desk reject, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. And our editorial assistant, Louise Maskill, the interesting thing about this role that people don't always know, and it's different for each journal, but for System, she receives all of the manuscripts, every single one of them, and then is able to process them. So makes decisions based on whether or not she needs to send them back to the author for other details or for anonymization or anything like that, but then assigns them to us based on our availability and based on our expertise. But yeah, she sees all of them. So this is a really important thing. So as editors-in-chief, we don't actually choose which submissions we handle. That's all done by Louise. So it's done really in a kind of good independent way, because yeah, she's kind of outside that world. She's not in academia, even though she has her PhD in applied linguistics. Okay, so yeah, a couple of details about this. So the team does work effectively. Our review time, we've managed to keep the average under 10 weeks in total, so that's pretty good. The publication time, you'll notice, and this is really thanks to Elsevier and the production team more than anything else, but yeah, less than 2 weeks to get our papers available to readers. The readership, it's the usual places, Great Britain, China, and the US, but notably kind of more focused on Great Britain. And then you'll also see a couple of things here like the acceptance rate, which is 17%. That maybe doesn't seem so great, but it's not bad considering just how many submissions we get. I'll show you those numbers in a moment. And our impact factor here, this is the data that I got. I thought this was 2021, but I think that maybe it hadn't updated, so I just added it here. Our 2021 impact factor went up, and I have to say this in a really bragging way, but at that impact factor, that sets the journal System ranked number 12 out of 193 journals in the category of linguistics, which is pretty fantastic. So I will also show you kind of some of the reasons why System is where it is, and also kind of confirm and clarify what this means for what happens to submissions with the journal. So this is just highlighting some of the statistics that were provided to us by our publisher. This is submitted manuscript and rejections from 2021. So total submitted papers is 1,157. 873 of those were rejected. That includes desk rejections and standard rejections. We accepted 197. Out of the total 1,157, 60 were withdrawn or removed by the submitting authors. So in total, we published 145 papers in 2021. That's a lot. that's significantly more than previous years. I think 2020 was 120 papers. So we are making adjustments to this, but we're recognizing that System is a popular journal and it's a little bit of a catch-all journal. And I'll explain that a little bit when I dig into the aims and scope a bit more. Rejections from System, they're pretty high. Our standard rejection rate, however, is at 18%. And so so of the papers that do go to the review process, right? So there are almost 2 out of 3 that are rejected, that are not sent to the review process. So the desk rejection rate is 63%. I'm going to, just kind of briefly address some of the kind of the primary reasons for desk rejection. These are, as editors, these are kind of the reasons that we've come. This is the list that I've created for this talk. So I don't actually have this as a list somewhere. This is based on discussions that I've had with my co-editors. But these are also reasons that we see from reviewers. These are reasons that we have ourselves as reviewers. So I'll kind of try to go through each point and signal where I'm going to talk about things in more detail. For example, the first one, and that really is the biggest one, is whether the manuscript is the study, the paper, is a poor fit for the aims and scope of the journal. This is a pretty easy reason to reject a paper. With the number of submissions that we have, we're kind of looking for easy reasons to reject so that we can focus on the ones that stand a good chance of being published. So these are papers for us that are missing a kind of key element of the aims and scope that I'll highlight in a bit. But it is a bit tricky. We are educational technology. We're applied linguistics. What are we? So I'll explain that in a bit. And I'm sure one of our it's a lot of our own fault that we have papers that don't fit the aims and scope. The original contribution to knowledge may be unclear. This could be for any number of reasons. Maybe it wasn't highlighted well enough. Maybe it wasn't linked appropriately to development areas of current understanding of our topics. We don't have a sense as readers in what ways the manuscript is pushing the field forward, projecting the field in some way, supporting it, opposing it. I mean, we need to know, right, what that original contribution is. It needs to be really very clearly stated. It should be clearly stated in the abstract. A manuscript can be rejected if it's not engaged in the most current discussions. It's surprising how often this happens. Basically, if you're kind of missing key, very recent research to refer to or to shape the study and the review of literature, in shaping the research questions, it's not going to contribute significantly to knowledge in the field. So because of that, we really look for that. So in terms of being engaged in the most current discussions, also tying it back to aims and scope, current discussions of papers published in the journal as well. A paper in System doesn't have to cite other papers in System to get published. You can find that in some of the most recent publications, but we do kind of look for relevance to our readership, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. Poor rationale, 2 words, but really, really important. The justifications, explanations, decisions, all of these have to be really well supported and really well explained. Whatever the study is, and it can be anything. It can be a paradigmatic explanation. It can be theoretical. It can be methodological. It can be in the findings. It can be in the implications. It can be in the limitations. If the explanations just aren't sufficient, if they're not well justified, well supported, it's not going to work. And this is something that we pick up on fairly quickly. As in, if it's not coming through clearly. So just thinking about that with rationale, the decisions that you make, you basically can't assume too much, but you also don't want to over-explain things that a general readership is going to already know, depending on subject knowledge, right? So kind of commonly known stuff. It's hard as an early career researcher to necessarily know what's an acceptable level of how much you need to explain. I think for the most part, when in doubt, explain it, and a reviewer or an editor will come back to you and make suggestions about cutting, some of the explanations. But you're better off explaining it than not, unless it's really very well known, common knowledge. I think methodology comes next, right? Design and decisions about your methodology. If it's unclear or it lacks rigor, I can tie this together with poor rationale as well. Methodology sections in a lot of journals can often get a bit reduced. I think there's a lot of assumption that, oh, the methods that come with this great reader out there, based on these research questions, that this is the methodology that's going to be used. But really, that's not helping anyone. I mean, we're really looking for methodological contributions as much as any other area of contribution. So we need to know, right, kind of why is this the right methodological design in response to these research questions? How does using this methodology contribute to knowledge? How does this help us to better understand or change our understanding about what you're researching? All of that's really important, and I think this is an area that we're looking for kind of a bit more. I think in a lot of cases, there's just been a little bit too much assumption about what gets done methodologically, and we really want to know the truth and realities about what's there. And I'm going to refer back to that idea about realities at the end of the talk. Arguments are not sufficiently supported by the data. This is an interesting one. Basically, it's hard, especially with a larger study, to be able to select the data that you need to support the argument that you're trying to make. It takes a lot of working through, getting others to read your work as much as possible, just so that they can see whether or not they feel that the data that you have selected to present in the study actually sufficiently supports your argument or not. This is something that you need to kind of check with others. It's hard because journals like System, most journals, they have word count limitations of 8,000 words, 7,000 words. Some of them are 6,000 words. Other areas, yes, it does go up to like 10,000 words, and even in applied linguistics as well. So check that, in terms of author guidelines for the journal to make sure that you are fitting into the appropriate word count. But yeah, those limitations are tricky, right? And it makes you have to pare down the data in ways that can ultimately not convince the reader that the argument is sufficiently supported. So be very careful. If the implications are not applicable to a wider audience, it may be rejected. Now, I've put a little star there to remind myself to comment on that, because I don't mean to suggest that the study needs to be generalizable to a wider, generalizable. Okay, it doesn't need to be quantitative. In fact, System publishes more qualitative research than quantitative research. Not every journal does that, but basically the point is that our readership is international, it's global. We want to make sure that if you are conducting your qualitative study in this very unique context, and it's this really in-depth thing that you're doing, that it's okay that that's not comparable to all of our readers' contexts. It's okay that that can't be generalized to their contexts. But if it's done in a way that allows them to think differently about that issue, that problem, that topic in their own contexts, then it's relevant, right? It's applicable. So this is the point about making sure that, whatever you've done with this work, that you understand who are these readers. It's not this very limited readership. It's actually quite a broad readership for a journal like System. I've put inconsistencies / poorly organized at the end. Basically, inconsistencies thinking about content. So if you've got any kind of contradictions of ideas, data that conflicts with something that you're trying to argue, anything like that, it's going to stand out pretty quickly, and it's going to be a basic, quick reason to reject. Poorly organized, basically that the ideas just aren't coming through clearly because they're too hard to follow. There are typical traditional ways of presenting research articles. I don't want to suggest that everybody has to follow some kind of formula or pattern. We really don't want to see that. We want to see innovative approaches in thinking and presentation. So just make sure that everything that you do is that you're keeping your reader in mind, that you're guiding the reader as much as possible. People talk, we've had conversations about this in the past with other editors about kind of weak writing or writing skills. This is really not something that we're overly concerned with, but obviously it's going to create problems for the clarity of ideas if the writing isn't strong enough. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. But obviously, you know, yeah, I don't know, grammar mistakes isn't going to be a reason by itself to reject a paper, just so you know, but proofread. Okay, so yeah, I've mentioned a few times I'm going to dig into the aims and scope. So this is from our website. This is our paragraph of the aims and scope. We try to keep it concise. This has been through many iterations, even in just my few years as an editor with System. And I'm sure it'll go through more changes. So, you know, I'm keeping an eye on the chat. Thank you, Sin Wong, for inviting questions and comments. If you have any comments or questions about this, the aims and scope, if you have any suggestions for any changes that you think should be made to it, please do let me know and we'll consider them. But yeah, this is a fairly typical aims and scope. It's brief. We try to cover everything, which means that it ends up being fairly general. So what I've done is I've just kind of gone through and highlighted a few things to point out what it is that we look for, and these are points that we use in our reviewing and editing to make decisions about submissions. Remembering that this is an international journal, right? So thinking of that international readership. Focus areas, educational technology and applied linguistics, but most importantly, applying them to problems of foreign language teaching and learning. And I think this is the part that does sometimes get missed. We do get submissions about educational technology that aren't dealing with language. So that's a pretty quick and easy desk rejection. But it's the kind of thing that you just need to be careful of when you're targeting, when you're submitting a paper to a journal. And it's really one of the reasons why we do still strongly recommend cover letters, right? Kind of using the cover letter to highlight and clarify why this is the right journal for this submission. You know, highlight the contributions to knowledge and show how it fits in and addresses that readership of that journal. So problems of foreign language teaching and learning. Highlight a few of the languages here, right? Clarifying that when we talk about foreign language, yes, for example, English dominates for sure, but also Chinese, Arabic. I mean, System also publishes quite a lot with foreign language learning in European languages. So that, you know, there is a range. System requires articles to have a sound theoretical base and a visible practical application for a broad readership. So that's going to, you know, there again as a reminder about this kind of, yeah, broad international readership. But that sound theoretical base, visible practical application, those are also points that can sometimes be missed and that we'll use as reasons for rejecting a manuscript. And then this final statement about review articles, so different type of papers submitted to System. They can be considered if they deal with critical issues in language learning and teaching with significant implications for practice and research, right, that are relevant to that aims, the aims and scope above. And get some water. Okay, so I'm moving on now to give you an idea of what are some of the behind the scenes stuff that informs the way that we as editors think about what's important to the journal and what are the kind of contribution areas that we're looking for. So this is focusing now on topics, and highlighted here are the 10 most cited papers in System from 2021. And I've done this just so you can, just to give you an idea of movements and focus are like hot topics. You'll notice here that actually the first 4 papers, the most cited papers, are all in positive psychology, right? So you can see, you know, stress and negative emotions in the top one, foreign language classroom enjoyment, yeah, achievement, emotion research, personality, well-being, right? So all of those are positive psychology. And it really is basically System's big area, right? So that these are the papers that are getting cited. We end up kind of focusing quite a lot on that. This is the kind of thing, right? So so what you would note as someone submitting a paper to System, as you would say, you know, as a reader of System Journal, I have noted that, you know, a lot of the most cited work is in positive psychology. Therefore, my paper on positive psychology fits into this. Now, at the same time, because we publish so much on positive psychology, you have to explain to us what is unique, right? What is that original contribution that's different from all of these other papers that we have on positive psychology? You can't just say, oh, you guys do a lot on positive psychology, so here's my paper on positive psychology. Here's my paper on foreign language anxiety. We've got lots of papers on those. So what is it that's unique to that? You know, refer to those papers and show us, and you can do this in a cover letter. It doesn't have to be necessarily in the literature review, but just to show, right, well, this is what System has done with this topic, and here's what my paper does. And this is how it adds to that, extends it, challenges it, whatever it's doing, whatever that original contribution is. The fifth most cited paper you'll see on oral and written corrective feedback. This has been a really big topic area for system over the past couple of decades. And so, yeah, you can see it here. I mean, this is a review paper, right? So 25 years of that research, but it yeah, continues to be a popular topic. Going back to positive psychology, thinking, feeling, making, boredom. Okay, here in eighth and ninth most cited papers, you'll see self-regulated learning strategies, self-regulated learning. So our language learning strategies, self-regulated learning area. This was our big hot topic that positive psychology has kind of taken the place of. So it still continues to be really popular in system. It's really important for our readership, but it's actually an interesting development to see there what's happened with research in that area, where there's a certain element of kind of saturation about topics, about the way the topics are treated with the methodologies that are used to address them. So this is something that we're kind of seeing happening a bit now with the stuff that we have in positive psychology, although it's such a broad area that there's a bit more potentially, a bigger period that this may last. Obviously, along with our most cited papers, we're also interested in our readership. What are the most downloaded papers? What are the topics that they're focusing on? It's probably no surprise we're talking about 2021, and especially as a language education technology journal, that people would be looking at papers on remote teaching during COVID-19, right? You can see the first and third most downloaded papers are on those topics. And then you'll also see, language learning strategies in there, as well as some more positive psychology as you go through the list. So these are our kind of big topic areas for sure. Oh, something that I had wanted to show you on the previous page. Yeah, so notice that with the most cited papers, none of these are older than 2019. So, there's a real point to where what we're saying with system is we really only want the most cutting edge stuff. We want you to be citing this stuff that's really new. And so you can see, right, that people are doing the same thing with the newest papers that come out of system, right? That these are the ideas that are getting picked up by people and published in system and in other leading journals. But it's cutting edge, really recent. When it comes to downloaded, sometimes they're just kind of big topics, right? So individual differences, for example, you can see there, right, that the paper dates back to 2003. Second most downloaded paper last year, Learning Styles and Strategies, from 2011. It's a paper that's been downloaded actually by now more than 80,000 times. So it is interesting to kind of note that about longevity of a topic and what is going to continue to interest readers. Okay, so getting into some of the maybe maybe less desirable information for you to know, but submissions accepted and rejected for all content by publication item type. Book reviews, for example, so we had 75 submitted to system in 2021, and 38% of those were rejected. The thing with book reviews is a lot of them are commissioned, so that's going to kind of keep the rejection rate down, but then certainly commissioned and uncommissioned book reviews can be rejected, depending on quality. For the most part, commissioned book reviews do get published, but it just does all depend on that. But that's why that rate is the lowest. Correspondence, you can ignore that. We don't publish that. Full-length articles, over 1,000 submissions last year, and 84% rejection rate. Now, that does seem rather high, but think about that. That means 16% of those papers were published, which isn't too bad. And basically, the other bit that makes up for the published papers, then you can see review articles, 91% of those, so more than 9 out of 10 were rejected. Full-length articles are our main focus. I mean, you can see even in just the number of submissions, over 1,000 full-length articles versus 38 review articles. Publishing 3 of those out of 38 is going to give us a 91% rejection rate. Short communication, things like introductions, commentary, summaries of research reports, things like that. We don't get many of those. We had 14 submissions last year, and a 90% rejection rate. So it's got to be fairly important. I think for the most part, the ones that were accepted were basically introductions to special issues. I think a lot of the other stuff we just don't really have space for in system. So overall, an 82% rejection rate in 2021. Okay, so what this means for manuscripts that are advanced to the review process, we're looking at more than a third, not too bad, that really go out for review. Here, what I've done is I've just highlighted from the journal website the information that's available about peer review. And just to clarify, that system does operate on a double anonymized review process, and that this is typical of journals in the field. Contributions will be initially assessed by the editor for suitability to the journal. So, right, basically can be desk rejected for you as your peer, right, and editor. Papers deemed suitable are typically sent to a minimum of 2 independent expert reviewers to assess the scientific quality of the paper. The editor is responsible for the final decision regarding acceptance or rejection of articles. The editor's decision is final. So just to kind of clarify on this point, so I said earlier there are 5 of us as co-editors in chief, and there's also an associate editor who handles independently submissions. And for the most part, we make those decisions ourselves. That information isn't available on the website anywhere. We are a team, and whenever we have any questions about submissions, it may be related to recognition of other editors' areas of expertise. It may be when we have a little bit of doubt about a decision that we will contact, not necessarily the whole team, we'll contact a couple of editors, who would have that kind of expertise on the, overlapping expertise with the submission to kind of say, this is what I'm thinking in terms of a decision for this. What do you think? Or even should this go out for review? What do you think? So, we do make those decisions a little more collaboratively, but a lot of them are made on our own. It may feel like that's a good reason to kind of argue against a journal, to say, oh, but the editorial team, did everybody get to look at this? But the reality is, we handle a lot of submissions, and the reliance is on us to make those decisions. The decision is final. It doesn't mean that a paper can't be revised heavily and submitted as a new submission later on. That certainly happens with system, and I'll show you a little bit later on in one of my comments to authors that it's even a suggested statement that I have for them about kind of, look, this paper is rejected, but, see what you can do with it. The point about double anonymized review, it means the identities of the authors are concealed from the reviewers and vice versa, right? So the reviewers don't know who the author is, and the author doesn't know who the reviewers are. We have talked about this as system, about potentially changing this so that reviewers who want to, that their names can appear as reviewers of that paper. There's a lot to be said for that process. I mean, some of my co-editors will argue vehemently against this. But there's a certain distance, of course, when it's a blind review that maybe potentially reduces the sense of need to be more caring or thoughtful with comments. And it can maybe come through a little bit more harshly because nobody's connecting those comments to you as a person. So, there's some of these ideas where maybe if the reviewers weren't blinded, right, if the authors knew who the reviewers were, that maybe that kind of level of dialogue with them, would help to create a more professional engagement. It's just really, really tricky, and I recognize the arguments against it as well, because you never know which reviewers are going to be available. Sometimes you get the leading people in the field as reviewers, and other times you don't, and that kind of inconsistency, I think, can kind of mess up that process. So something that we need to kind of think about later on, but something for you to think about with the process. That you can expect different things. Some journals, you may know who the reviewers are, and maybe you'll see that happening more and more. All right, so getting into some of the examples. I've got 2 examples. The first one I wanted to highlight because it was a really tricky case for me. This is a recent one. And what happened was the submission came through to me. I thought it looked really interesting. It looked like it would be relevant to system readers. I invited 2 reviewers, one of whom was a leading scholar in the field on this, who agreed to review, and then another reviewer who does work in this area as well. The 2 reviews came back, and one was toward a minor revision decision, and the other one chose major revisions, but even that was borderline. So I've highlighted what that reviewer said here to me. So this wasn't addressed, this wasn't what was given to the authors. This was just a message from that reviewer to me, who said, I appreciated the opportunity to read the manuscript. It's interesting, it's pertinent nonetheless, and this is why I highlight these points. The theoretical and empirical bases of the study are poor. That's very worrying, right? Normally you would see something like that as an editor and go, ooh, and provide some explanation for it, noting that really what this reviewer has seen in this manuscript is a paper that might be okay for a professional journal, but not really a scientific journal like System with its global readership that presents research that is motivated by current theoretical and empirical findings. So this was something, right, the current theoretical empirical findings, the rationale, these bits, right, just kind of weren't coming through clearly or strongly to this reviewer. The reviewer explained that, the scientific contribution and originality of the paper are not evident. But constructively, right, and this was a point that the reviewer was making to me as an editor, that the reviewer felt that the paper could potentially be reconceptualized and grounded in state-of-the-art research, right? So kind of bringing the literature up to date and kind of challenging that literature a little bit differently, then it could make a valuable addition. Right, the reviewer chose major revisions. Okay, so I've got major revisions and minor revisions from this other reviewer who I also absolutely trusted. Based on that, I decided on to revise. I invited the authors to revise, and the authors revised, and they sent back with that revision their response to reviewer comments. This is something that is, of course, expected with revised papers. Creating a table is an excellent idea, where you've got comments, right, in each row, and then addressing, right, each of those comments as to what you did in response to that comment, whether you made the change or if there's a point that you want to question or challenge in some way. But there are definitely ways to do this. I have to credit the authors here in this case. I think what they did, first of all, the reviewer hadn't numbered the comments in a way that would be directly addressed. There was more of this kind of flowing narrative. So the authors were able to kind of group the comments together into the rows, right, to kind of address them. So that was what happened in this kind of big one where some ideas were kind of brought together because they were all around this idea of redundancy and issues of kind of clarity. And so the authors kind of grouped that together and explained that they revised for clarity, flow, and redundancies. They addressed the specific section that the reviewer addressed to say that's been revised for a clearer argument and improved flow. They've also identified where the reviewer can find a sentence that was added to demonstrate, right, this point is a very specific topic that I've had to remove for anonymity, to say, well, we addressed that point on this page, we've added this, so you'll find it there. Another typical comment from a reviewer, right, you should define this term that's specific to this topic in order to establish a common framework, right, so kind of connect with the direction and discussion that things are going in on this topic. The authors appropriately thanking the reviewer. This is always really important. We've added further clarification on page 4. So this is just an example of an organized and respectful response from reviewers or from authors to reviewer comments. So one of the things to think about with that little note that I wanted to make is it is pretty important to politely and kindly respect and accept what reviewers have said. If you disagree with something, there are ways of saying it without saying, no, you're wrong, so we didn't do it, right? That's just going to upset a reviewer and also be really careful about anything that could come across as sarcastic or patronizing to a reviewer. It's really the last thing you want to do is upset a reviewer or editor. It gives your paper much less chance of getting published. Okay, so yes, in the author's response to reviewer comments, did a good job, looks really good. I thought it looked good. I sent the revised manuscript back to the original reviewers, which is the usual process, to review again. Have a look at what they've done. And this reviewer did not like it. So the other reviewer who was like toward minor revisions had gone for minor revisions this time. Thought, oh yeah, good, okay, you've done these things. This reviewer, who is kind of one of the big experts on this topic, explained, I was totally disappointed, right? Even though they said that they did all these things in their response, as I read the paper, I noticed only unsubstantial changes were made. The review of the literature doesn't do what it needs to do. The research questions aren't motivated by the review of literature. The methodology remains weak. The research design isn't justified or acknowledged. These are all the points that were raised in the first round, right? To kind of say, these are the things that you need to do. And basically saying, okay, you said you did them, but you didn't really do it, and you didn't do it enough. So the methodological procedures are not theoretically grounded or justified. Discussion and conclusion sections are poor, lack theoretical empirical substantiation. All of this, it's really tricky. And at the end, we're kind of saying the typos, all this stuff, it really makes it seem like this is a careless revision. And at this stage, this is, it's just not going to be good enough for a research journal. Maybe you could send it to a professional journal as a constructive, idea. But saying, right, this is a message to me as editor. Based on the poor response, I selected reject. But the reviewer also kindly uploaded a PDF document with detailed comments for the authors. So I was a little stuck here now. So I had kind of aligned response, but a little bit divided, and now a completely divided response from my reviewers. For the most part, with a journal that's this busy with as many submissions that we're dealing with on a weekly basis, we would say, oh, one of the reviewers has said reject, we have to reject. But of course, that's only if the editor reads through the reviewer's comments and says, oh yeah, I see what you've done, or what you're saying here, and I agree with you. And that was the case for me for this. I had read through the manuscript. I kind of thought, oh, okay, they're doing some interesting things here. I like what they've done. I'm not an expert on this topic, so I didn't really know for sure, or the methods, in fact. So, I'm familiar, of course, with the area, but then based on these comments, I made me see it differently. So what I thought I needed to do was invite a third reviewer. This is often what we do. I also spoke with a couple of my co-editors about what we can do. The third reviewer was fairly optimistic, right? Kind of thought, oh, the responses were good, which was what I had thought as well. And then says this, right? However, while the theoretical framework seems appropriate for the context, it's not clear how this fits in with the study. The methodology attempts to generate theory out of data. If the theoretical framework was selected before the commencement of the research, this would weaken the foundation of the theory generated. If these specific findings, if this is something that emerged out of the research, it should be presented as a rather interesting and important finding rather than a pre-existing framework. Based on that, and based on the other reviewers' comments, and my understanding based on what I read, I rejected the paper. Now, this, so basically, if your paper goes out for review, of course, it doesn't mean the paper is going to be accepted. Reviewers can suggest rejection. Even reviewers, two reviewers could suggest both saying major revisions. An editor can look at that and say, this is too much work. So have a look at this. Basically, I had said to the authors that, as the reviewers were divided, with consultation with some of my co-editors, we brought on a third reviewer. Who was optimistic but highlighted concerns that remained. And we, just agreed, the topic was good, but basically the biggest problem was the progress, right? So based on what happened between the initial submission and the revised submission, it wasn't enough. And we're looking at this thinking, we don't have the resources to handle this. We can't do 5, 6, 7 revisions. So that's, unfortunately, we're unable to consider manuscripts that do not have the clear potential for publication after the first round of review. And as we are now at the second round, and my co-editors agreed, we cannot continue in the review process. So, really sorry about this, but do consider addressing these concerns, and you're certainly welcome to submit a completely revised manuscript as a new submission. So this is the kind of thing that can happen. You might think, well, I'm in with a shot, but check and just make sure that you understand the reviewer comments, respond in responsible ways. Don't say that you've done something, but then not really do it. Maybe there was a fundamental misunderstanding. I'm not sure. Okay, the second example, second of two, is one that's a little more positive. In the first round, essentially one major, one minor, but I'm kind of focusing here on the minor revisions. Some comments from both of the reviewers in this case. You can see this idea that there's quite a lot of notions that could impede readers' understanding. So, look at some ways that you could strengthen your argument by clarifying some of those key notions. Another reviewer very specifically kind of highlighted, well, can you do this with the abstract and do this with the introduction and theoretical framework and discussion conclusion? These are just some of the notes that I've put in here. So the authors had, quite a bit to work with here, but not too much, and really pretty concrete stuff, mainly because it was quite a strong paper in the first place. The study itself, neither reviewer had any issues with. It was more around kind of contextualization of the study and some of the presentation around the framing of it and the theoretical framework supporting it. So based on that understanding, the authors in their revision had explained, so in their response to reviewer comments, so they didn't create a table in the same way, but they kind of didn't need to either, because there wasn't the same kind of narrative of reviewer comments. There was just kind of like, oh, this is the problem, maybe you could do these things. And so they said, okay, we did all these things, right? So everything you asked us to do, we changed the abstract, right? We moved the descriptions of context to a new section. We moved the theoretical framework as suggested. We've expanded on the introductory paragraph of the findings section to highlight the themes, and linked subsections for better transition. We expanded on the limitations and the conclusion. So basically, right, this works well. If you're, as an author, if you're able to agree with everything the reviewers have suggested and address them in really positive ways like this, it's not surprising then that those reviewers come back with a suggestion to accept, with a decision to accept, and say things like this: I think the authors have done a fantastic job in revising the article. It looks much more improved than the previous version, and I recommend publication. Based on that, because I got a pretty similar response from both reviewers, I then go through the manuscript again to just kind of check and confirm, does it look like all these points have been addressed? I think in this case, I did actually send it back to the authors again to kind of make a couple of more changes, and then I was able to accept that paper for publication. All right, so just to finish up my presentation and this talking head that you're very kindly hanging in there for, I do, like Xin says, please do post your questions. I'm keeping an eye on it, and I hope that at any time, please feel free to put questions in there. But I've just got a couple of just 2 slides left. This one is one that I just wanted to use to highlight a couple of things about where I'm coming from as an editor, and kind of who were some of my mentors in the process of learning how to author, review, and edit. So first of all, Andy Gao, who was a co-editor in chief of System for 9 years. And so we overlapped for a couple of years at the beginning of my tenure as an editor, and I really just learned so much from him. He's an absolute powerhouse of an editor, absolutely incredible. And he had actually written a chapter for a book that I edited, published in 2017, called Doing Research in Applied Linguistics: Realities, Dilemmas, and Solutions. So I mentioned realities much earlier, and it's this point about kind of embracing the messiness of social research. For those of you who are engaged in social research, recognizing that things don't always go to plan, and there's going to be just some unexpected things that you have to deal with. In the section in that book that Andy's chapter is in, this Gao 2017, this is at the kind of publication stage. And what he does in this paper is he reflects on the unexpected responses that he got from reviewers on his submitted work. And what he did, and he shows a couple of excerpts from some of those reviewer comments that he received. Blind reviewing, right? So no name connected to who, the rather harsh comments that really, when you read them, there's really nothing constructive about them at first glance at all. What he does is he explains how he managed to kind of turn those into and recognize the constructive nature of it, that there's something there, recognizing that the readers are the most important people. It's how what you're presenting in your manuscript is being received. If it's not being received well by people, if they're kind of throwing this back at you, hopefully not in such harsh ways, there's still something to be learned from that. And that's what he outlines and highlights so eloquently in that chapter, that I really do recommend reading that as a way of kind of learning how to accept the rejection, right? It's tough. I think as an early career researcher, a lot of us have experienced a lot of success, like mainly success. And then when you go to publish, it's mainly not success. It's mainly rejection. So adjusting to that is tricky, and especially when you're receiving such harsh criticisms, when for most of our lives, right, as an early career researcher, we were receiving positive and really helpful and supportive comments. So it's that adjustment that's really quite tricky. The other face on my screen here is Professor Brian Paltridge, who I worked with at the University of Sydney. He was actually my original PhD supervisor. And he was editor of TESOL Quarterly, also a big leading journal in the field of applied linguistics and language teaching, just before the current editors. And he does research in this area, and one of his papers in 2013, so actually while he was an editor at TESOL Quarterly, he investigated reviewers' perceptions of how how they kind of learn to review. And basically the point that they made was that they learned how to do reviews by reading reviews of their own submissions. And this is where and he makes the point that it's really a potentially vicious cycle, where, right, we're giving these harsh comments because we don't have our names connected with them, and then the people reading them are learning, okay, that's how you do reviews, and so they're being just as harsh. Really tricky. He makes the point, though, the most challenging aspect of this is simply it's being critical but still constructive, and I think that's the point. It's how can we make this constructive? Basically, you just want to be thinking about that, as a reviewer, as a writer who's receiving the comments. Look at it and think about, how can I make this into something constructive? How can I use this to help to support, what my work, and even if it's not getting published in the journal that I got these comments from, hopefully to another journal. All right, so just to finish, a little recommendation to train and register as a reviewer if you haven't already. Elsevier journals always have links to where you can register, sign up, create your Elsevier profile, and put in your topics of interest. Give as many as you can, use the right terms, and the journal editors will find you. You can also email journal editors if they don't have that kind of system, to kind of let them know why you're interested in reviewing, what your areas of expertise are, what your background is. I've also highlighted here Taylor and Francis, another big publisher in the area. They do things like they have a reviewer training network. They do asynchronous and synchronous peer review training. So I do recommend checking that out if you can. All right, whew, I've talked far too much. Going to stop there and invite questions.
Thank you very much, Jim. That's a very, very interesting presentation. I especially enjoyed the two case studies. I think that's precisely what I was looking for as an early career researcher. How editors made decisions. So I think that's very, very valuable. And I like the way you finish your talk by kind of hinting on the importance of becoming a peer reviewer, even for early career researchers to think about it, right? And how you may benefit from it. Okay. I think there is a question there, Jim, from one of the participants. Yeah.
Okay, so how might we check if we've addressed reviewers' comments enough? Yeah, especially for early career researchers. I totally get it. Yeah. It is tricky to know for sure. I think one of the biggest things is to think about making sure that you're sensitive to the reviewer's concerns. I think it's making sure you understand, what the comments are getting at. If there's any question or confusion about it, then that needs to be clarified, in the response. That's something you can do by contacting the editor before submitting it. But if you feel that you do have a sufficient understanding of it, but maybe not entirely sure, then you can put that in the response, in the response to reviewers' comments. Now, the other really important thing, I think, and I've seen this happen a lot, is there's a bit of defensiveness that can happen as an early career researcher that's related to the kind of long history of people saying nice things about your work and trying to be really supportive and encouraging. And suddenly you're kind of getting potentially slammed by really discouraging sometimes reviewer comments. Editors who will try to kind of clean those up a bit. I've removed whole statements and small paragraphs from reviewers' comments that I think are just not helpful. They're just kind of on the attack, and I'll think, oh, pull that out. But it doesn't mean that that's always going to happen. I think it's good just to think in a way of, all right, how can I make this constructive in some way? Let me understand it that way, and let me respond to it that way. I think if you see it as an attack, then you won't see it as supporting or shaping your work in any way or informing it in any way. And in which case, your response is going to be to push back. I think the most important thing is how can you look at what they've done, and yeah, and just kind of be grateful and say, look, I'm just grateful that you read my work at all. Don't remove the sentence that says I wish you hadn't been so nasty about it. Delete that, and just kind of say, it's I recognize what you're doing. My understanding of your comment is this, and therefore I've responded in this way. Be positive. Be kind, be gentle. They won't be.
Yeah, and in addition to typing your questions and comments in the chat, you're also very welcome to raise your hand if you want to ask the questions
Yeah.
yourself, or just say hi to Jim. I mean, you're most welcome to do that. And Jim, just on the topic of responding to reviewers' comments that the Hui is asking, you showed us an example of a table of having comments and responses, and also the other example of not having that table format.
Yeah.
Do you think reviewers or editors have a general preference for either of those?
I think the preference is for the table. I think one of the big things, even if the reviewer has kindly numbered each of the comments, even if that's the case, putting that into a table just makes it really easy and quick for everybody to grasp. And so I think that's honestly, it's the best thing you can do. We've added that to our guide for authors, that we've said, create a table. Not everybody does it, but it's there as part of the guide. So yeah, it's definitely the preference. I think that example that I showed where they didn't do it, it was really because basically they had almost numbered their comments, and then their responses were basically matched up with those. So it made sense. But honestly, I kind of felt like they still could have put it in a table.
Right. All right. That's very helpful. Thank you. Noor, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Oh, hi. Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much. It was very informative. Every time I see that there is an editor talking about what happens behind the scene, I'm like, okay, I'm jumping in. It's funny because I'm a PhD student, and my topic is about understanding and actually looking at what are the difficulties of early basically PhD students who are trying to publish, and the context is it's specific to Algeria. So I was like this morning, literally sitting and writing the section from my findings where they say that they need to develop a writing for publication culture. And then I came to this, so this one was perfect. But my question is not going to be about that. It's basically a new question. From all what you said, if you have any 2, 3, whatever takeaways that you can give to early career researchers, then that would be great.
Oh gosh.
I know. Yeah.
Yeah.
That question.
I mean, honestly, I think the biggest thing that I don't know, as a supervisor of PhD students and as a journal editor, I think probably the thing that I've noticed the most for early career researchers, and you are absolutely in that category of early career researchers, is the prepare yourself for rejection. I think that's probably one of the biggest things. I didn't have it myself. My supervisors hadn't really told me about it, and when I was getting rejection after rejection, it was just so frustrating, and I didn't know how to deal with it, and it slowed me down, which was really quite sad. I think there's a point of remembering resilience, remembering that you got to where you are, through hard work, and yeah, a lot of encouragement, but you're not dependent on that encouragement, right? You are the expert in this, right? You do know this stuff. You don't have to say to reviewers who may be critical of the way you've presented something, to remind them. You don't have to say, well, you don't know what you're talking about, as tempting as that is to say. But I think it's that, just that kind of ability to have that confidence in yourself, to be able to just graciously accept whatever criticisms come from reviewers, from examiners, whatever it is, to try to turn it into something positive. That's why I always say to everybody, read that chapter by Andy Gao, because he's just, it's just so nice the way he said he's taken these really quite harsh comments from these reviewers and explained how he turned them into something productive. So I don't know. I think that's probably the biggest thing for me.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Nice. Okay. Let's see. I have a lot of questions. So Jim is here.
From journal editor.
No.
Journal editor.
Oh, there is another one from Laura. So Laura said, I think the danger is for us to take rejection of our writing as a rejection of us as a researcher. Especially appreciate your reminder to see it as constructive. Yeah, I think that's.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I think it's exactly right. It's kind of personalizing stuff when clearly they're not. So we shouldn't do it ourselves. But there's that idea that try to see it as constructive. Why didn't they receive it well, and what can I do differently about it? Yeah, I actually had I'll share it with you just because we're a nice cozy bunch. I had this funny experience early. So, out of my PhD, I had my PhD thesis. I had a paper that the examiners told me that's the paper to try to publish. You should try to publish it in the journal System. And I thought, okay, great. So that was the first paper that I pulled out of my thesis, kind of structured it, sent it into System. It went out for review and was rejected. And I thought, oh, okay. So, and don't know where to go now. The examiners said I should try System, and that didn't work. I ended up sending that paper to 5 more journals, and it was desk rejected from some. It did make it into the review process from most of them, and almost made it through a bit further with one of those next 5 journals. As in the editor had kind of said, "Oh, if you want to keep going with this, we can," and so I pulled it. But yeah, the interesting thing with that process was, so that's 6 journals that rejected that paper. But I kind of took bits on from here and there, and in some cases it really wasn't anything constructive. In some cases, the desk rejection was just a bit like, "This isn't good enough. Sorry, I couldn't do anything with that." But I tried to take all those things and form something out of it. And the most interesting thing is, so basically we're talking kind of, I don't know, a couple of, like 2 years later, basically, maybe even more, 2.5 years later, I had taken all that, reformulated the paper, sent it to System, and it was accepted. So sometimes there's a journey, and sometimes it takes a while. But yeah, and it was a good thing, because based on having published that in System, I was able to become an editor. So that was, all worked out.
That's a very, very encouraging story. I think sometimes we know rationally that the feedback targets the work, but not us. But because I think especially for PhD students that they've worked on their thesis for a number of years, that's kind of what defines them as a researcher. And now you're saying my hard work for 3 years, 4 years is not worth publishing.
Yeah,
it's quite yeah, I get it. That kind of feeling, it's kind of hard to manage. Yeah. Jim, I wonder when I talk to ECRs about submitting to like high-ranking journals, because they would, especially those who would like to get an academic position, they're looking for, they aim high, but they always ask the question, how do I know that I'm ready or the work is ready? Because it's one of the top. So for example, like System, it's 12th out of how many in linguistics. How do I know my work is up to that standard? I'm publishing with some of the leading authors, leading scholars in my field. How do I know?
That's a really good question.
Or will I know? Will I ever know?
Will I know? I mean, I think this is the thing with just thinking about some of the processes, because we've published papers from PhD students, we've published papers from master's students. System's done it all. It's there's a little bit of everything. I think the thing that's interesting is a really good study is going to come, it's going to read well. It's going to come through, and I think there's something about a good study, how it's sold, that makes the difference for those higher ranking journals. Because it's tricky. It's something I didn't get to say, so I'm glad you brought this up. That often with System, we'll have really good studies, well-written papers, but if it's not pushing the boundaries enough, it'll get rejected. And it's a shame, but it's basically, look, as as a journal right up at the top of the field, we have to have the most cutting edge stuff. We have to have controversial stuff. We have to have stuff that people are going to read and cite. It has to have that element to it. It can't just be good research. It can't just be, oh, put that on the pile of good papers. So I think this is the thing that is, gets a little bit lost, I think, in the process of how to sell yourself. When I talked about the a bit of this topic before, it was actually really not that different from the podcasts that Bira did. So I did that through the Center for Doctoral Education at UCL in the IOE. I talked about this idea of imposter syndrome and kind of how to fight that, as an early career researcher, to say, well, who am I to make these claims? Who am I to state this? And, it always comes down to, well, you've read this stuff. You've read this stuff like anybody else. You know where what you've done fits in, doesn't fit in, whether it challenges, the statements that have been made, whether it extends it in some kind of interesting direction. You know whether it does those things. If you're going to be aiming for the top journals, you need to be able to state that clearly that it does those things, and you need to have the evidence to support it. If you don't have that, and it's hard to know. I mean, this is the thing. As an early career researcher, how do you really know whether or not you've got it? Definitely check with people. I've received emails from people sometimes saying, is this something system would be interested in? Is this kind of cutting edge enough? I have had things like that as an editor, and I think it's perfectly okay to contact editors about that. I mean, if you contact me, I'm going to tell you to submit it, because I think just go ahead and submit it and find out. But I think that it's the kind of thing where you try to believe in yourself, state it, right? Go ahead and say it. Say this is my understanding of what's happening, and this is where it builds. They'll tell you if you don't have it, right? So the experts will come back to you and say, okay, so you've said this is, where we are right now in this field, and that this is where your research does this thing. Okay, so this is where it didn't do that, right? So maybe what you've said about where the research is, you're actually missing some of these key studies that you didn't mention, so they'll tell you what those are. Great, now you have them, right? What you've said that your study does, by extending that or challenging that in some way, they say, it doesn't quite do that. You can say, okay, that's fine. Let me figure out what it does do, right? And see in comparison to my understanding of what this is. And, potentially, if it's not pressing the boundaries enough, if it's not, that significant of a contribution for knowledge, it may need to go into a slightly lower ranked journal. But remember that, if it's in the right journal, it's going to get read and it's going to get cited. And so even if it's not the highest ranked journal, I mean, it's true, the highest ranked journals are the ones that get read and cited the most. So it is good to aim for them. But just thinking about the aims and scope of a particular journal, that if it's a really good fit for your paper, I think kind of after trying the the highest ranked ones, but have a look at those to kind of say, well, this is a good fit. It's going to get read and it's going to potentially get cited in that journal. So something to think about.
Right. Okay. That's good. Thank you very much. Yeah. So keep the questions coming, comments coming. I'm just asking questions because I have so many questions. So I'm going to just use my role as a host to use my role as a host. Anyway, so I have Jim. You talked about pushing the boundaries and originality contribution to the field. I wonder if you can give us some examples of what you mean, because I think, for example, you talked about topics on positive psychology. So people have worked on anxiety, boredom. I don't know. So am I to pick another emotion to focus on, so that's originality? Or are you talking about, like, for example, methodology, or even the context where the study was conducted? I don't know. Can you give us some examples of what you mean by originality and contribution?
Yeah. Oh no, that's excellent, because and I think talking about positive psychology is a good way to go, because this is we're starting to get a bit saturated, and I have rejected perfectly good papers by saying, it's like, look, we've kind of already published enough of what you were arguing in this paper. We've already published enough of that in System, even just this year and last year, so that's the kind of statement that I'm making in my desk rejection to some really leading scholars in the field on these topics. It's not easy to do, but it is. Yeah, it's this point about identifying what's out there, right? And this is why I was saying it's something that you could potentially do in a cover letter. If it's something that, it's not really necessarily the thing that's shaping your research questions, but it's this thing that you want to make, its point about why this paper is good for this journal. You can highlight that to say, look, your journal's doing this, right? Your journal's saying this thing about these things in these ways. You know what it's not doing is this, and that's what my paper does. And so it's, there's a bit of really making it super explicit to editors and reviewers that, look, it's not necessarily a gap, right? It's more like, I'm trying this new thing, right? I'm trying this thing that's a little bit different. I noticed, right, that there's a lot of this kind of stuff happening, but people aren't really doing this, and so I'm trying this. So there is a bit of that. There's definitely room for creativity with that kind of thing. Methodologically, I think there's a lot of space for that. I think people don't do enough of that. I think really reflecting on the methodological processes that are involved, especially in areas like positive psychology, that we're seeing it more and more for sure. But I think that's the kind of thing where you can say, look, there have been calls for people to be more honest about the messiness of doing this kind of research. I'm addressing that in connection to this really hot topic and how, yeah, we're getting a lot of research on it, but I'm doing it in this way. And so I'm kind of spelling it out in this way. So I think there are potential link ups to do things like that. Theory, again, as well, right? People are saying, okay, I'm combining these two theories in a way, or mixing paradigms, which is, a little bit scary to do, but I've seen some really interesting frameworks that are set up that way, kind of challenging stuff. So I was saying, look, this isn't, I'm looking at mixed methods in a different way, right? So I'm looking at mixed methods. My approach to mixed methods is this. I'm taking this paradigm, which is, a combination of these theoretical frameworks, which sure, these people have done, and you can kind of link to that because it's pretty hard to find something that hasn't been done already. But, not necessarily in this specific topic area with these learners, with this type of learners, with learners at this level, with learners in this context. So there are definitely all those areas. I think geographic context as the only thing that's different is a hard sell. But at the same time, journals are also trying to be much more geographically representative. And so, if you have, for example, Northern Africa, if we're talking about Algeria, for example, right, there's not a lot of research being published on Algeria as opposed to the U.S., UK, China, so these kind of bigger representative places. So there are some possibilities of doing things there, but yeah, just has to make sure that it's not just that, oh, look, I've done this and I've done it in Algeria, and so that's new and different. People are going to go, okay, that's great for people in Algeria. It has to be, I took this new thing, I did it in Algeria, and it made me understand this topic or this concept differently, and think about what that can mean for you to think about that concept differently in your context. That's the kind of thing we need to see when it comes to context.
I think that's very helpful, and also a distinction between an international journal and a regional journal or a local journal. I think that logic, it's very important for us to think about, new contexts of conducting research. So I think that's very good to know. Okay. And also another thing I think of when you talk about originality is to have an extra pair of eyes to tell me that this is original. And you talked about, showing the manuscripts to different people, experts, and even to editors. I wonder what your view is towards co-publishing or co-authoring with your supervisor, because I think that's something that a lot of PhD students have done. I've heard very successful, encouraging stories. I've also heard very catastrophic stories for whatever reasons. Or maybe sometimes it's just the supervisor's too busy. But then the student is trying to publish. So what's your view on this of having a co-author who may be a more senior or experienced researcher?
I'm all for it. I think it's good. I've done a little bit of publishing with some of my supervisees in the past, but not a lot. Mainly just because I'm one of the ones that's super busy. I think there's also a point to where, depending on the research topic, that the specific research that they've done, that maybe as their supervisor, that that I'm really not the right person. That as much as I'm super familiar with the project and I've helped to guide it. That I may not be the right person. I think the most important thing, thinking as an early career researcher of inviting a supervisor or some other person to co-author is to kind of read the willingness of that person. If they're really keen to engage with the research in the way that you want that research to be without changing it to kind of fit with any other types of agendas that you're not comfortable with, then fine. I think, certainly I've trying to think with some of the work that I've done, with the collaborative work that I've done, I have made some pretty significant changes, by working with others, just because I really appreciated their recommendations. They've kind of said, what you could do this. And I've gone, okay, great. And that's how I knew, okay, that's somebody that I do want to work with, and this is someone I can collaborate with. So I think it's about kind of comfort level working with them. I do want to say, don't feel like you have to publish with your supervisor if you don't want to. Don't feel like you have to publish with any other kinds of experts. Or I've heard from people in the past where they say, oh, the only way to get yourself started is by linking yourself up with an established scholar. It's really not the case. I mean, your work, as published, if it's good, it's going to get read and it's going to get cited by anyone. It doesn't matter, authors' names. Um, I I say that, and then I'm also a little bit I have my reluctance because, of course, we kind of can't help but acknowledge that yes, there's a certain element of superstardom and celebrity in academia. We do know that there are some big names in the field, and linking up with some of those scholars, yes, can be really helpful. If these are people that you're working with, that's great. I mean, don't try to hit them up, with a cold call. That would be really weird. But you can ask for comments and feedback from people, and you might be surprised who you might end up working with based on that. Yeah. Lots to say on that, but hopefully that's okay.
Yeah, in my conversation with some of the doctoral students, they always ask whether their names, the authors' names, matter in the editorial process before when the editor received the manuscript, and because the editors can see the names of the authors, so they may be thinking about it's an added advantage if they have somebody who the editor may recognize. So at least that gives them a chance to undergo the peer review process. I wonder, is that something the editor considers? I mean, or do they primarily look at the manuscript? I mean, I'm asking a difficult question, but I mean,
No, it's a good
can you explain to us how you go through the process from you receive the manuscript, and how do you determine whether it's suitable to send out to peer review? Of course, you talked about all those criteria, but I mean, yeah, can you give us a little bit more information? Thank you.
No, absolutely. No, it's absolutely true that as an editor that we see, that we see we've got the whole manuscript, of course, and that's got we also have the kind of title page with all of the details about authorship. But just kind of on an initial screen, when we would look through our submissions, it just has the corresponding author, that name with the title. So once we click on it, then we can kind of go in and get into those details. I mean, in terms of whether or not that has an influence, I think I have to say that it does. I think there's, a certain element to where if I see, if I know that that's a kind of leading prominent scholar on that topic and that person has submitted, when I click on that, I do already have that in mind. That's like, oh, okay, this is a paper from this person, on this field, on this topic. I'm interested in seeing what this is. So yeah, there is that element. But I mean, otherwise, for the most part, the thing that I'm looking at first, I look at the abstract first. I look, I'm kind of I kind of tend to do that really quickly, even before I look at authorship. So I've already kind of gone and depending on my interest level with that, I've already gone into the quick look at the methods and discussion and findings and concluding implications. Like I'm really kind of looking through all that, and then it'll kind of come back. I think some of the things with authorship, in terms of the way that it comes through to editors is it's undeniable that an editor isn't going to notice authors. I can't say, oh, I don't look at that. I mean, that would really just not be truthful. So yeah, but you shouldn't feel like, oh, mine's a name that these editors won't have seen before, therefore, that they're not going to consider it. That's definitely not the case. I think if there's ever any kind of concern about anything like that, you can be really explicit in the cover letter to say, look, this is who I am, and this is where my expertise comes from on this. This is my doctoral research, and I am an insider researcher from this context, and I've worked with these people, and I've had feedback, and this, you can say all those things, if there's ever any kind of concern that people might not trust you as a researcher just because they don't recognize your name. For the most part, yeah, I don't recognize most people's names. So.
Right. Thank you very much, Jim. I think Laura has another great question. So as an ECR, how much consideration should be given to audience? Citations may come from submitting to a prestigious journal, but real impact may be greater if you publish for practitioners somewhere, which may give you less chance of citations. Is this a conflict people have to think about?
I love this question. It's a conflict that you have to think about when if you're thinking about who you're doing your research for, right? I think for a lot of us in education, we're thinking about the teachers, we're thinking about the learners, we're thinking about, I think especially thinking about the professional journals for practitioners. And there's an element there which is interesting. Now, I've done research on this exact topic, thinking about the language teaching research nexus. And it is interesting, that there is an element of language teaching researchers who do believe that the research that they're doing, is meant for practitioners and is meant for teachers to read. But then at the same time, we'll say it's not the concern as to whether or not it does get read by that. It just needs to be in the highest impact journal. So sort of professionally, for their own academic careers, that's the most important thing. So there's a bit of pessimistic, sort of lack of integrity in that kind of response, where somebody's saying, oh, I just need the stuff to get, I just need the numbers, trying to reach teachers, really should be the goal. Journals do, I think this is aiming for particular journals, I think is the thing to keep in mind with that. So, for language teaching research, a study that I did recently was published in the Modern Language Journal. We were talking about, the focus was on representation of the people who are publishing in journals that, according to their aims and scope, target readership that is both researchers and teachers. And so they included 6 different journals. We looked at the bios of the authors who published in those journals to see how are they identifying themselves. Were they identifying as researchers? Were they kind of providing people with their teaching expertise, or were they just really focused on research? And interestingly, for the most part, they were focusing on their own research and they would explain, because I'm publishing in a journal, without kind of recognizing that actually, if you said, oh, but I was a teacher for 10 years in this school, that actually teachers who are reading this would look at that bio and look at your paper differently. And so, it is interesting how that does get a bit lost. So I think in response, Laura, to your question, what I would say is definitely check the aims and scope, check to see, how much practitioners are reading the journal. Sadly, I have to say that with System, we didn't include it in that study because it took such a kind of broad brush stroke to applied linguistics research that we decided it's just targeting researchers and not teachers. Whereas these other 6 journals, including journals like the Modern Language Journal and Language Teaching Research, language teaching, that they do explicitly target teachers. So, address that, right? So, in your cover letter with the submission to that journal, you can say, I'm targeting this journal because this journal explicitly states that teachers read it, and I want teachers to read it, and show that, right? Where the study that you've done in your paper has explicit implications for practitioners. So, put that in there and say, look, this aligns with what you said you do. And hopefully editors and reviewers recognize that. And that's a real advantage to getting published in those journals.
Thank you, Jim. I think that's very interesting, and it's the whole issue of the definition of impact and reach, and also think about access. Even those journals claim that the practitioners read them, how many practitioners really have access to those art. I mean, it's interesting to think about, what your audience is. So, yes, I don't want to keep the talk, later than it should be, because it's Friday evening for Jim, and so, but I just want to say a big thank you again, Jim, for agreeing to speak to us. It's very helpful, and it's the type of talk that I have always wanted to be part of, because it's very personal. At the same time, it's very in depth. I think it's not just descriptions that you read on the website. So thank you very much, Jim. And also thank you very much, everybody, to be part of this event. I just want to take 30 seconds to promote the next event, if that's okay. So our next online webinar on journal peer review will be on the 14th of October. And this time we're going to start at 10 a.m. UK time. And this time we're focusing on 2 higher education journals. So we'll have 2 speakers. The first speaker is Professor Malcolm Tite from Lancaster University. He's the editor of the journal Assessment and Evaluation in Higher Education. The other guest speaker is Dr. Jitsun Jun from the University of Hong Kong, and she is one of the editors-in-chief of Higher Education Research and Development. So if you're interested in higher education research and journals, be sure to register. So thank you very much, Jim. Thanks again, and thank you very much, everybody. Have a nice day.
Thank you.